On Thursday, the United Kingdom will decide on whether to stay in or leave the European Union. One of the most talked about issues of the referendum has been immigration. Those wanting to leave claim EU membership has brought intolerably high numbers of people to the UK. Well, Simon McGregor-Wood has managed to get out of Southampton, is now in London for us. Good morning to you, Simon. So, the immigration debate is the big one, isn't it? Who's been winning on that, if anyone, in this campaign?
Well, you're right. It's one of the two big arguments, and it is the one that is owned, I guess you could say, by the Leave campaign. The strength of the argument on it is that you simply cannot argue with the numbers. They're there in black and white. 2015, net migration was 330,000 people. 184,000 of those came from the European Union. And the Remain camp's arguments on economy and the likely consequences to the British economy of leaving are all feel slightly speculative. And even the Remain camp, even David Cameron, and it is to some extent his Achilles heel, understands that those kinds of numbers are unsustainable in the long term because, as I said in that piece, the pressure that they bring to bear on things like schools and hospitals and other public services. And those are sort of grassroots issues that British voters feel. It's not necessarily about being per se anti-immigration. It's just that people in the country here feel this extraordinarily accelerated spike in the numbers coming in a short space of time. And I think politicians on all sides realise that they need to do something about that. The argument is whether or not the Leave campaign will tell you the only way to do something about it is to leave the European Union so that this country can reassert control on its immigration policy. The Remain camp is trying to persuade people that no, that's not the way to do it. The best way to do it is to stay within the European Union and try and change things internally. But it is a very persuasive argument, and I think when the Leave campaign's polling has been positive, it is really because the answer coming back from the grassroots, from the voters themselves, is that immigration is connecting with them.
Absolutely, and it does kind of split the campaigns, doesn't it, Simon? Those on both sides who believe the immigration debate and those who believe the economic arguments. Now, only got 2 days left to go. What messages are coming out in the last minute? Is there any chance that the Remainers will try and get onto that immigration ground and try and win the argument from there in the last couple of days?
Well, I think what we're going to see in the last 48 hours is a kind of concentration on the core messages from both sides. One's getting rather weary of it, I have to say, after following it for several weeks, but the Remain camp will keep banging the drum on economic fear. More statistics available. We have George Soros, the famous or rather infamous currency speculator, talking today in the British press about the likely collapse in the value of the pound in the event of a Brexit. And I think for sure the Leave campaigners will continue honing their arguments on the immigration issue. By the way, I think the immigration issue is also symbolic, it's emblematic. I think they're connecting with people's desire to reassert national sovereignty. It's hand in hand with this idea of getting more control back from Brussels. It's also one of the more powerful arguments that the Leave campaign has. We've got a big event this evening at Wembley Stadium Tuesday night. We've got leading figures from Remain and Leave slugging it out in front of an audience of 6,000. And one last point, we've got a very interesting intervention on Tuesday from David Beckham, one of this country's most iconic footballers. He has just come out the last few hours declaring his support of the Remain camp.
OK, well, Simon, for now, thank you very much. And now we can cross to our Jon Brain, who's in Brussels for us, looking at the European perspective. So, John, we had Donald Tusk yesterday coming out calling on the British public to stay. What kind of response we had the day after?
Well, those appeals are still continuing from EU leaders. As you say, Donald Tusk on Monday appealing directly to British voters to remain. It's a reflection of the anxiety within the Brussels establishment about the possibility of a Leave vote. But they really don't know quite how to play this. They're aware that their comments can be counterproductive because they play into that narrative of Brussels dictating to the British public what they should do. So they're a little bit unsure about how to play this. They have toned down the comments. Earlier, of course, Donald Tusk was talking about the possible demise of Western civilization and was ridiculed for that. But make no mistake, these are anxious times in Brussels as they wait for that vote on Thursday.
Absolutely. Well, you've said anxious, John. Is there any sense that with the slight Remain bounce that we've had recently, and also the markets showing positive news that Remain has slightly gained ground, that they're feeling more confident over there?
No, I think they're not really taking anything for granted now. They've had a real shock at how close this referendum has become, and the real prospect of a Leave vote with the opinion polls in last week, certainly. And that's given a real wake-up call, and it's noticeable that as well as appealing to the British public to vote to Remain, they are promising that the EU will reform, that it won't be the same as it's been, i.e. a little aloof, that it will listen more to the people in the various countries, not just Britain, but there are pressures building across the continent now for a different sort of EU, with the threat that more people may push for a referendum in their own nations, and that, of course, would fatally undermine the EU.
Absolutely, and John, that's one of the interesting arguments looking ahead. If Britain does vote to Remain, that with Cameron getting those concessions, minor concessions, but concessions nonetheless, the acceptance of those concessions in places like Berlin and in Paris, that the EU does need to reform, and Cameron might be the man to push it forward.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you repeat that question?
Sorry, yes, John, of course. With those concessions that David Cameron managed to get a short while ago, there's a feeling across Europe now that Europe does need to reform, as you said, and David Cameron, if they vote to Remain, may be the man to push that forward.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. David Cameron's credibility has really been undermined, certainly in Britain, with this whole issue. It's not thought that he got the sort of concessions which were suitable for the British people. I certainly don't see him as creating a template for the rest of Europe. Whether he even remains in power if it's a tight vote is questionable as well. But there will be pressures across Europe. Of course, nothing is now going to happen until we know the outcome of that vote. But there will be a different EU in some form, which will evolve in the coming months and years. If Britain votes to leave, then that difference will be much greater.
Absolutely. Well, John, for now in Brussels, thank you.